Hey guys, Trevor here again. Thanks for joining me today. I want to talk to you about the setting of the Broken Empires role-playing game today. A lot of you have asked me on the Discord or Facebook or YouTube, can I use this game without the setting? My answer to that is, well, of course you can. Why would you? I put so much work into my setting. But yes, of course you can. You can lift it and use it in any setting you want. Some of the things we're going to require a little adjustment, like the concept of magic is really tied to this setting, but it's not really hard to lift it up and make a few adjustments and make it work for whatever sort of low to mid fantasy setting you're looking to run the game in. But in terms of this setting, it's kind of interesting because the setting when I started this whole process, which was back in 2019 on the first video of the channel I ever did, which was the first episode in the first season, which I didn't know it was going to be the first season. I thought it was just going to be the season and then I'd be done, where of course we were exploring the world with or through the eyes of the character of Simon of Argistan. I knew nothing about the setting when I started. Zero. I knew that Simon was a ranger and he had a half-orc friend and that friend was being led to execution in a little mountain village, and that's it. That's what I knew. And everything that we now know about the setting of the Broken Empires has evolved from that central point. And it's pretty wild. When I look back at even the aspects of the world that we discovered just in season 1, where we were exploring the Westlands and parts of northern Angevard. Now, at the time, we didn't know it was called the Westlands in northern Angevard, but we do now. But even when we were exploring that stuff, we found out so much about the world. We found out that there are undead in the world and that they're kind of a scourge. Like, that's a real problem. We found that there are multiple gods, and those gods actually physically use their minions to fight each other. The tidal wave threatening the city of Hundatora in the middle of season 1 is a good example of that. We found out that there are cities run by councils. We found out that there's a sort of a feudal system in place. We found out the general technology level of the world, which is very sort of bog standard, medievalish, Europish kind of, at least that part of the world is. So we discovered a lot. And then in season 2, of course, we went up to the Ironlands, which technically is in this setting, even though you won't see a map for it, because if you want to see a map of the Ironlands, you got to go buy Ironsworn by Sean Tompkin. But Sean has allowed me to use the concept of the Ironlands in this setting. So there is something in the world called the Iron Veil, which separates the Ironlands from the rest of the world. That Iron Veil is a shimmering blue-green veil in the sky that you really only see on cold nights up in the far north. But it literally is a curtain that separates the Ironlands from our world. And there's a whole backstory about the Ironlands, which I actually describe in the first episode of season 2, where I talk about how the Ironlands is essentially like fantasy Australia, where all of these empires, shipped off their criminals. So we learned about the Ironlands, or my version of the Ironlands, in season 2. Then season 3 came and we learned about the Serpent's Teeth Isles and Tikal Dandala, and we explored a part of the world which was very Caribbean, which was very piratey. We discovered that there's gunpowder in the world, except only for cannons. In this world, nobody's thought to put gunpowder in a gun yet, just in a cannon. Now, maybe there's some other reason for that. Maybe it just literally doesn't work. This isn't our world, remember, but the frame of reference is strong. Gunpowder does work, but right now, for whatever reason, people use it in these cannons on ships, and that's about it. We learned about the League of Free Lords, which is a group of pirates that exist in the Serpent's Teeth. We learned about the essentially armada, kind of like analog to the Spanish Armada that the Tikal Dandalese have, and how they're sort of spreading out among those islands trying to take over. So we learned a lot of stuff. We learned that there's a whole culture of lizard men who have been hiding for centuries, and now, because of the actions of one of our protagonists, have decided to sort of peek their heads out of the mists again and reemerge into the world. And that they were influenced by a goddess by the name of Devona, who has particular interest to two of our protagonists, as a matter of fact. So things started to make sense. Things started to tie together. But what we learned is, overall, even before we got to season 4, which takes place in sort of this like fantasy Egypt / Arabia kind of setting. But what we learned is that there's all of these parts of a much, much wider world, and that they all have different feels, different atmospheres, different cultural touchstones. For me, when I've run games, that it's very important for me to have a very strong frame of reference to be able to tell my players so that they immediately can kind of lock in and understand what world we're in. So, if I say to them, yeah, guys, this is basically like 12th century France, boom. They know, okay, I got it. They can see it. They can see the armor, the weapons. They can see the food, the castles. They get a sense of the peasantry and the political system, and they get all that stuff. Now, once I have that frame of reference, then I can start to futz with it. Then I can start to adjust it and change it and modify it so that it is not, in fact, 12th century France, but in fact, it is current day Angevin, which is the analog for medieval France in my world. So Angevin is very much like France, but it is not France. Just like the Westlands is very much like sort of pastoral England, but it is not pastoral England. Tikal Dundallah is very much like 16th, 17th century Spain, but it is not 16th or 17th century Spain. You get the idea. There's a lot of different frames of reference. And I think one of the influences I had was Gray Box Forgotten Realms. When I first got that set way back in the 80s, 85 maybe, I think the first edition of Forgotten Realms came out. It's still my favorite edition. I love the Gray Box. I love the original because it's so wide and suggestive. It doesn't give you too many details. It gives you enough details to fire your imagination and allow you to fill in those giant empty areas with your own stuff. I just love it. But the thing about the early editions of Forgotten Realms was that they gave you these little pockets of cultural areas that were very reminiscent of real world places that just gave you enough to get a frame of reference, and then you could sort of fantasify it from that point on, right? So that was really useful. If you look at the world of the early Forgotten Realms, and presumably the current Forgotten Realms too, although I'm specifically talking about the early days, there were areas that were clearly supposed to be like, oh, this is kind of like a medieval Spain as, conquered by the Moors kind of thing. Or this is clearly like feudal England. Or this is clearly like some sort of like almost Wild West fantasy kind of thing, way in the north. Or this is clearly like a Viking kind of culture. But they weren't just carbon copies of those. They were suggestions. I love that so much, and I've done that a great deal in the Broken Empires too, because I believe that frame of reference is important. And once you have a solid frame of reference, then you can start to adjust it, and you can start to throw some curveballs, and you can make it unique and make it its own. So one of the things that we discovered early in the game, in Season 1, was that there were orcs in the world, and that orcs were pretty savage, but some of them every now and then actually showed something akin to honor. There was an orc by the name of Mord that Simon encountered early on, and he was an orc, and he was dangerous and a savage and all that kind of stuff, but he also had some sense of honor, a little bit, enough to get by with Simon in any event. So that tells us something. That tells us about that there's orcs. In the very first episode, we see that there is a half-orc character. Okay, we know that there are half-orcs in the world. Okay, how does that come to pass? If the orcs are these savage kind of beasts and monsters that just kill all the time, how are there half-orcs? Well, we have an idea of how that happens. But that tells us something about the world. It tells us something about the culture. There are many cultures of humans in the world, right? We've already explored so many of them in the show, and we're going to explore more of them in the book. There's the Westlands and the Thessians. There's the Ironlanders. There's the feudal empire of Angevin. There's the Serpent's Teeth Islanders. There's the Blacklands of Dune Blaine, which is where Edbert is from. There's Old Vestria, which was basically like the empire that ruled over everybody for a while way back. Kind of like Rome-ish, but not really. There's the Hohenzollers, which are kind of like a Holy Roman Empire German analog, except they're seafaring. It's very interesting. The Vixgradians, which are kind of influenced by the Russians a little bit. The Red Waste tribals, the city-state of Ansharir, the barbarians of Drangia, all different kinds of human cultures. And they all have certain skills that they're better at and things like this because of their upbringing, their culture. So we know that there's all these different cultures of humans and that they all have their own languages. And there's a whole list of languages here, right? These languages are all related, but they're not the same. We know that there's half-orcs, as we already know. We know that there's dwarves. We knew that from Season 3 when there was a dwarf character that was introduced. But my dwarves are a little different. My dwarves are a wandering race that have no home. And in fact, the 13 tribes of dwarves are a scattered people always on the move. Many living aloft on their ancient airships, artifacts of a bygone age of ingenious craftsmanship. But none of the dwarves remember how the airships actually work. They just go through these sort of mindless religious rituals, semi-religious rituals in order to keep the machines working, but they don't know how they work. So they hope that the things don't crash. Then there's a couple of other interesting races, which I'm not going to tell you about right here because they're kind of a surprise, but it's pretty cool stuff. Everyone always asks me about elves. Well, we know that there are elves in the world because we've already met them in season 2, but those were iron elves. Those were the elves of the Iron Lands. No one in the Broken Empires has seen an elf in a very, very long time, but they did exist once upon a time. They were called the Duanan Seed, and they were very, very, very influential. And then one day they left, and they haven't been seen since. Now, they left behind quite a legacy, and there's always rumors that maybe the Duanan Seeds might return. In fact, there's been sightings in the far north, or maybe that was just mirages in the cold. Who can tell for sure, but it's possible the Duanan Seeds may be returning. Anyway, there's all kinds of cool stuff with that. But also, you know, like the idea of introducing gunpowder as part of the pirate ships of the Serpent's Teeth Isles, that gives you a very different feel than playing in Angevin, which is very feudal medieval France, which gives you a very different feel than playing in Ansharir, which is like this fantasy Egypt, fantasy Arabia. So within the setting, you can find all these different atmospheres and flavors. So if you want to set a game in an area that really feels like Holy Roman Empire era Germany, but you want to have a bunch of like naval adventures, there's a place for that. If you want to set a campaign in kind of an Irish Celtic folklore inspired part of the world, that's the Blacklands of Dune Blaine. You can set it there. If you want to set it in a more kind of Tolkienian pastoral England thing, you can do that as well, the Westlands and Thessia. If you want to set it in the far north, you can do that with Viksgrad. If you want to set it in the far east, you can do it with Onamaru, which we have not yet detailed. Perhaps in a future supplement, we will talk about the far east. But the point is that the Broken Empires gives you so many different flavors of types of things to explore. Now, I will say as well, it is a low magic, low fantasy world, which means you're not going to have people walking around casting spells at each other. You're not going to see dragons, you know, flying over cities. You're not going to see all of these crazy races living in one big cosmopolitan Waterdeep style thing. That does not happen. It is a low fantasy world, which means that even though we know that half-orcs, dwarves, and others exist in the world, it doesn't mean they're very common. They're still kind of looked at askance because they're rare, they're unusual. That doesn't mean you can't play these things. In fact, far from it. There's all kinds of character creation rules to allow you to play those things. But it's just something to keep in mind, that in a low fantasy world, the majority of the population is going to be human. Magic, it does exist in the world, but it's not ubiquitous. People don't walk around casting spells all the time. You know, you don't use magic for everyday things. You don't use magic for things you could just as easily do with good old-fashioned elbow grease, because it's too dangerous. So magic is reserved for those who are truly messing with powers beyond the ken of most folk, and that keeps things very grounded. You also are not going to find crazy, like, mega dungeons in the wilderness populated with monsters by some mad wizards because game, right? Like, that's not going to be a thing. Unless you specifically make it a thing, which of course you're free to do whatever you want. But by default, the setting is very grounded. So there's going to be, if you find a ruin in the wilderness, that ruin is going to have a purpose. You know, someone used that ruin for something before it was a ruin. You know, was it a temple? Was it a fort? Was it a homestead? Was it a castle? What was it? A seat of government? Whatever the case was. Any denizens that reside there are going to be there for a reason. Unless the creatures inside that ruin are all undead, they're going to have a food source, right? You're not going to have a situation where you've got a tribe of goblins and a troll living in the same cave system unless they have some sort of agreement to be able to share food or resources, whatever the case is, and maybe that's something the players can actually exploit, much as you do in an adventure like The Keep in the Borderlands, right? The Caves of Chaos. You can go in there and actually pit different groups against each other if you're thinking, which is very cool as well. But by default, the places you find in the world are going to be grounded. They're going to have a reason for existing, and whoever is there now has a reason for being there. So the whole notion of this crazy mega dungeon filled with traps, that's not really what this game does. It doesn't mean you can't do it. You can. It just doesn't really... That's not where this game shines. If you want to do that, there's a bazillion different games you can use to do that. If you're looking for a dungeon delver, then go use Shadowdark. This is not really the game for that. This is not really a setting that inspires that. Again, doesn't mean it can't happen. It's just not really designed for it. So it's a low magic, low fantasy setting, but that doesn't mean that big crazy things don't happen, because they do. Anyone who's watched my show knows that Edbert is the main protagonist of season 3, and his principal antagonist is a literal goddess who is essentially screwing with him the whole time. In season 4, the first thing that happens in the introductory opening movie is our character walks through a portal that takes her 1,000 leagues across the world to this desert. So big things do happen. That's why there's rules in the game for it. That's why there's ritual magic and things like this. A low magic world does not mean a no magic world. It just means it's low, it's less, it's more like our world than not. And so when it is not like our world, that's something to remark on. That's something to pay attention to, because it becomes interesting, it becomes important. So yeah, that's a little taste of the setting of the game. It's always evolving, and we are certainly planning on releasing a bunch of other supplements, future Kickstarters, in order to flesh out the world. Now, somebody also asked me a very good question. They said, are you going to cap the timeline, much as Harn, my beloved Harn, much as Harn does? In Harn, they never produce a supplement that has anything taking place past a certain year. Right now, I'm thinking that's probably the design we're going to go with as well, and for the same reasons. We don't want to put out a supplement that is now going to somehow undermine what you as a GM have already created for your table, because that sucks, and we don't want to do that. So I will probably create supplements that essentially detail the world up to a certain point, and then past that point, that's going to be entirely up to you to take the world wherever you want. I think it's the fairest way to handle that. But you know, we'll see what happens. We're not there yet. We got to get through the first Kickstarter. And by the way, if you haven't signed up for the Kickstarter yet and you are interested, play.thebrokenempires.com to become a VIP. You can do that all the way up until Tuesday morning when we launch the game at 8 a.m. Eastern on Tuesday, October the 1st. 7,000 people already signed up to join, and growing every day, which is amazing. So I think it's going to be very successful, and I cannot wait to bring this game to you. It's been such a joy going through this process. Thank you all for your support. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time on Me, Myself, and I.